Order. I will call Mr. Luke Charters to move the motion, and I will then call the Minister to respond. There will not be an opportunity for the member in charge to wind up, as is the convention for 30-minute debates. Order, order. Mr. Luke Charters to move the motion.
I beg to move that this House has considered the regulation of the bailiff sector. Thank you, Mr. Weston. It is a pleasure to serve under your chairship. I also extend my gratitude to my honourable friend, the Minister, for attending this important debate. Let me begin with a story. A vulnerable, disabled person answered a knock at the door. He placed the chain on before opening it slightly, only for a bailiff to force their way through. The bailiff treated him, in his words, like a waste of life, a loser, scum. Worse still, the bailiff went on to wrongfully seize equipment supplied by the local authority to help with his disability. This is not an isolated case, and today I'll share similar stories that expose the impact of a partially regulated sector and make the case for urgent reform. The aim of today's debate for me is simple. I'd like the government to legislate for the introduction of an independent regulator for the enforcement sector.
Can I commend the Honourable Chairman? This is a critical factor. And does he agree with me that the rise of TV programming that shows people at their lowest being evicted or having their possessions repossessed shows very often the despair of ordinary people and the attitude of the bailiffs depicted sometimes shows a lack of compassion that should not be the standard, and that kindness and a basic level of respect has to be the foundation, and to back it up, the Honourable Member is right, we need the legislation.
Well, I thank the Honourable Member for his eloquent words about what is often the most challenging moment in people's lives, that knock on the door where it is a cacophony of everything that they're facing. And I think it's that we've got to bear in mind. Now, Mr. Weston, the Enforcement Conduct Board voluntarily regulates approximately 95% of the bailiff sector. However, the 5% who refuse to sign up are responsible, in my view, for the vast majority of the worst abuses. Even within the voluntarily regulated sector, problems persist. With hundreds of thousands of visits per year, millions of cases and billions collected annually, bailiff enforcement is a massive operation. But according to citizens' advice, 1 in 3 people who had contact with a bailiff experienced behaviour that broke Ministry of Justice rules. Even among regulated bailiffs, 1% of visits were deemed aggressive by the ECB in recent research. We need a fair, proportionate and efficient collection system, and that's why I'm calling on my honourable friend, the Minister, to set out a timetable for consulting on the legislative reform to introduce statutory regulation of the sector, to put the ECB on a statutory footing, something that charities and the ECB alike support. The fact that the sector is partially unregulated drives rogue bailiffs. I hope I can convince colleagues from across the House of the need for this. And under the May government, there were some reforms, but it's our chance as a Labour government to stop rogue bailiffs for good. Mr. Weston, let me start by turning to the link between debt and mental health. Debt does not exist in a vacuum. Many people facing bailiff action are also dealing with illness, relationship breakdown, or mental health struggles. Now, one person shared their experience of over 5 years of pressure from bailiffs over council tax debt they never understood nor could afford. This ultimately led to suicide attempts. And Mr. Weston, I struggled with whether to mention suicide in my speech today, but we cannot ignore these cases. Take the case of Jerome Rogers, a young man whose debt spiralled after bailiffs clamped the motorcycle he needed to work. Shortly after, he took his own life. The coroner identified the debt collections agencies as a contributing factor to his death. Another woman recounted how a bailiff laughed and mocked at her when she mentioned her mental health struggles. And also Molly, whose name I have changed, was falsely threatened with prison if she did not grant entry to a bailiff, and that's not a permissible threat, by the way. The stress triggered flashbacks of domestic abuse she had suffered, and I know my honourable friend the Minister does such terrific work when it comes to this. Poppy, another victim, not her real name, suffered such severe anxiety over bailiff debt collection practices that she ultimately had a late-term abortion due to the stress of the situation. These are real stories, and Mr Weston, there are so many more. For too long, rogue bailiffs have not met standards when it comes to vulnerability, and that's why I dedicate my campaign for bailiff reform to them. The effects of aggressive bailiff practices extend to children. One parent described how bailiffs had knocked so many times that they were left with nothing to take except their young daughter's cot. It is simply unacceptable for children to live in fear due to a lack of regulation in the bailiff sector. And as a former regulator at the Financial Conduct Authority, I understand the importance of setting clear standards. The last significant change to bailiff regulations were introduced over a decade ago. It's time for an overhaul. The Enforcement Conduct Board was established in 2021, providing guidance but lacking statutory authority. Many firms voluntarily comply, but the absence of legal enforcement means rogue bailiffs continue to operate with relative impunity. We must introduce statutory regulation to protect vulnerable customers, reduce the burden on the judicial system, improve transparency, and provide a level playing field for the genuinely good bailiffs out there. So, in fact, in my view, better standards would level the playing field and support good professional bailiffs to do their work.
Will the honourable member give way on that point?
I will.
Thank you, Mr Weston. It's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship, and I'd like to congratulate the member for York Outer for this incredibly important debate. I think he makes a very powerful point about giving underpinning and legal powers to the organisation, because we simply can't have a case of rogue bailiffs marking their own homework and this organisation being reliant on their own funding from these organisations to clamp down on their actions. So is it really, to me, a part of this new the new powers of this organisation is that instead of just revoking memberships, we can take actual legal action against rogue bailiffs?
Absolutely. The ECB having that statutory underpinning would mean that they have much greater avenues around the enforcement, and they've already shown quite innovative work, in my view, around the use of body-worn cameras and so on, and a statutory underpinning, as I'll go on to, will support their work even further. So, Mr Weston, this is not about punishing bailiffs who do their job correctly. It's about removing rogue operators and raising standards across the board. It's important to acknowledge the good work of the Enforcement Conduct Board, but again, I stress it's a voluntary regime. As the ECB are looking to toughen up standards, the fact that it is voluntary can create problems. And on this matter, there are points I'd rather discuss privately with ministers, because there are always risks in the long-term survivability of any voluntary regime. May I touch on a few specific recommendations in this area? I think we should introduce a vulnerable customers charter. Bailiff action is a distressing event for anyone, but for people with mental health problems, it can literally be catastrophic. Aggressive debt collection leads many to take out high-interest loans, worsening their situation. A vulnerable customers charter would set out minimum standards of care. A bailiff registration service. A centralised register would help the public verify all bailiffs' credentials, reducing fraud and ensuring accountability. Delegating licensing powers to a regulator. Currently, bailiffs must renew their licences in court every 2 years. A regulator, such as the ECB, could take on this and streamline the process, reducing pressure on our already overstretched judicial system. Partnering local authorities with debt-advised charities. Rather than resorting to aggressive collection, councils should work with debt-advised charities to support people before they reach crisis point. And, Mr Weston, I've heard of cases of aggressive bailiff action where people have had debts as low as £10. And I think we should look at introducing a bailiff services compensation scheme inspired by similar schemes to provide clear pathways for redress in cases of clear misconduct and historical misconduct when it comes to rogue bailiffs. And can I close with one final story? Michael, a step change client, described his experience. The bailiffs are unregulated. It's like the Wild West. It's absolutely unruly. I absolutely agree. We cannot allow this to continue. We have the opportunity to bring order to this sector, to ensure fairness for debtors and bailiffs alike. Putting bailiff regulation on a statutory footing could save the taxpayer millions of pounds a year through easing the burden on the judiciary. It would immediately raise standards and protect our constituents in the most vulnerable moments of their lives, saving money and saving lives. So today, I simply urge my honourable friend, the Minister, to confirm that the Government will consult on bailiff reform. May I thank the MMHPI, ECB, Money Advice Trust and countless others for their thoughts ahead of today in this campaign. And a special thanks to Step Change, Vicky Brownridge, Richard Lane, Sophie Morris and hundreds of Step Change staff that do inspirational work to provide vital debt advice at some of those most difficult moments. And Mr Weston, my honourable friend, the Minister, has been a champion for victims of domestic abuse. And today we've learned of yet another grave injustice, one that has remained in the shadows for far too long, the rogue bailiffs scandal, which preys on some of the most vulnerable in our society. I hope that she and the Minister of State, in the Ministry of Justice, whom I also deeply admire and respect, will stand with me in ensuring that justice is done in this area too. To conclude, I came to this debate with one simple aim, that the Government will legislate for the introduction of an independent regulator for the enforcement sector. And I hope, after the points I've made today, the Minister will set out that they are considering doing exactly this. Thank you, Mr Weston.
Well done. The question is that this House has considered the regulation of the bailiff sector. Minister Alex Davies-Jones.
Diolch, Mr Weston. May I first start by thanking my honourable friend, the member for York Outer, for securing this really important debate on a very important subject today. The Government shares your concern to make sure that the public are protected against inappropriate enforcement action, and the harrowing stories that we have heard today demonstrate why this is so critical. And I'd also like to personally pay tribute to my honourable friend for the way that he powerfully and respectfully told those individual stories that have been entrusted to him of that first-hand experience, which is so important to us as parliamentarians, as legislators, so that we hear that directly. And what we have heard today should quite rightly shock us all about the scale of the issue. So thank you very much. I would also like to personally thank the organisations that my honourable friend mentioned, including Step Change, for the work that they do to highlight the impact of debt enforcement on the most vulnerable in our society, because that work that they do is immeasurable and absolutely vital. As my honourable friend said, figures from the enforcement sector indicate that they are sent about 4 million court orders each year for enforcement using the taking control of goods procedure. These debts and fines are owed to a wide range of parties, from private individuals and small businesses making individual court claims, to local authorities, central government and companies issuing large numbers of claims. The enforcement sector, therefore, plays an important role in supporting economic growth, funding public services and underpinning the rule of law. But the enforcement sector also has a significant impact on people's lives, as we have heard. And as the Minister with the responsibility for victims and reducing violence against women and girls, I can only imagine how intimidating it would be for a vulnerable woman who might be at home alone or with her children to hear that knock on the door or a pounding on the door from a bailiff. And that woman, and everyone else in society for a matter of fact, has the right to expect that there are laws and safeguards in place to ensure their safety. While the vast majority of enforcement agents do comply with the law, as we have heard today, sadly, some do not. and we share the concern to make sure that the appropriate safeguards are in place. For many years now, successive governments have sought to balance the need to ensure that vulnerable people are treated fairly with the need to ensure that creditors are able to enforce debts and fines. This government wants to ensure that the right balance is found between these two competing objectives. Back in 2007, the then Labour government recognised that the need to protect vulnerable people from aggressive enforcement action was needed and created an ambitious new framework with the regulation of bailiffs within the Tribunals, Courts and Enforcement Act 2007. Those reforms, known as the Taking Control of Goods reforms, were finally implemented in 2014. The 2014 reforms aimed to set out clearly and transparently the procedures that must be followed by enforcement agents when enforcing debts using the taking and control of goods procedure. Now, these reforms set out several safeguards to protect the public and particularly vulnerable people. They aim to disincentivise aggressive or unnecessary enforcement action, including introducing a compliance stage to give people an opportunity to pay without that visit being necessary. They also aim to provide protection against inappropriate and threatening enforcement agent action. Now, the reforms introduced a new court-based certification scheme for individual agents and, importantly, mandatory training to ensure that enforcement agents do have the skills needed to carry out their job effectively. The Ministry of Justice reviews found that these reforms had brought some positive changes, including improved transparency and consistency. But they also found that some enforcement agents were still perceived to be acting aggressively and, more importantly, they were not complying with the new rules. As a result of complaints being made about enforcement agents, the Justice Select Committee held an inquiry back in 2019, and in its final report, the committee expressed surprise that enforcement agents appeared to be under-regulated compared to other sectors. And it recommended that they should be a regulator, with the ability to stop unfit enforcement agents and companies from practising. The committee also found the complaint system for bailiffs to be fragmented and hard to navigate, especially for vulnerable people. It recommended that an independent complaints body be set up to which all complaints and enforcement agents could be escalated. In response to these findings, the enforcement sector worked with the debt advice sector and the Centre for Social Justice to create the Enforcement Conduct Board, the ECB, as we've already heard. Its mission is to make sure that all of those facing enforcement action in England and Wales are treated fairly. But, as we've heard, the ECB is a voluntary, independent oversight body. The enforcement sector have, on the whole, accepted its oversight, and the ECB demonstrated that it does have a valuable role to play. They have established an accreditation scheme for firms, which 96% of the industry has signed up to voluntarily. They have published professional standards for agents and the companies that employ them, and they are about to begin to consider complaints made against enforcement companies. They are establishing an independent data set about enforcement, for example, and they recently commissioned a study of body-worn camera footage, which found that in 6% of cases, enforcement agents broke the rules. But as we've heard, that 6% is too many. So, the ECB believes that legislation is needed to enable it to fulfil fully its mission as an independent body. And my honourable friend has set out some of the arguments in favour of the government legislating to set up a statutory independent regulator. Now, the government recognises that legislation could ensure a level playing field, meaning that everybody facing enforcement action would be guaranteed to be dealing with an enforcement agent and firm subject to the same standards, overseen by that independent body. It would also mean that everyone facing enforcement action would be able to complain to an independent body using that same procedure. My honourable friend has suggested a number of responsibilities and powers that a regulator could be given. And we welcome the debate on how government can build on the excellent work that the ECB has already been doing with the sector on that voluntary basis to protect those facing enforcement action. Let me reassure the House that we are considering all of these issues that have been raised today. We are also considering how best to engage with stakeholders to inform these decisions about whether further legislation is necessary and, if so, what that legislation should in fact do. It is important that we consider all of these issues very carefully, and we know that when regulation is done well, it can protect the public and support economic growth and innovation. On the other hand, poorly designed regulation can fail to keep the public safe and stifle economic growth, and it can also prevent regulated bodies from adapting to emerging technologies and new challenges. The government is also considering its response to a consultation held by the previous government on the reforms to the Taking Control of Goods Regulations 2013. This aimed to increase the proportion of cases that settle at the earliest and cheapest stages by, for example, giving people more time to access debt advice. And we are considering the findings of a report by the previous government which recommended uplifting the fees that enforcement agents can recover under the Taking Control of Goods Fees Regulations 2014 by 5%. We are still reviewing both of these issues and we will set out the way forward shortly. This government wants to ensure that the enforcement sector operates fairly, effectively and, more importantly, is regulated properly. The experiences that we have heard about today illustrate why it is so important that we absolutely get this right. As we move forward, we will continue to engage with Parliament and all relevant stakeholders to ensure that our approach is balanced, just and takes into account the needs of the most vulnerable in our society. And I extend that invitation to my honourable friend, other honourable members across the House to ensure that we hear from a wide range of views so that we get everybody's input, which is important if we are to get this right. But we are determined to get this right, Mr Weston. Thank you.
The question is that this House has considered the regulation of the bailiff sector. As many as are of that opinion say aye. Aye. Of the contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. Order, order. The sitting is now suspended until 2:30 p.m.